Thank you for joining us here today on Hill Country Network's From the Heart, where we tell stories of life because life is interesting. Today I have the pleasure of talking to Mr. Jimmy Reed. Hello.
Why, hello, Evelyn. How are you?
I'm doing wonderful. Thank you for talking with me.
Well, it's been an honor and indeed a pleasure.
Well, good. So we're going to be talking to him today about his books and about him growing up in the Delta and about some different aspects that we have going on around here.
My name is Jimmy Reed. I'm an author. Live here in Oxford. My wife, Gail, unfortunately is suffering from cancer and could not be with us this afternoon, but she wishes us well. Yes, 3 daughters, all perfect images of their father and beautiful. Olivia, Heidi, and Annabelle. Olivia's here in Oxford. Heidi is in Greece right now, and Annabelle is the city clerk in Hernando. 4 grandsons, Atticus, Lake, Finn, and Hollis, all destined to be Ole Miss football players. Well, I am what they call a Delta rat. I was born in a tiny little village, really, Dunleith, mentioned quite often in my writing, only about 50 people. It was a cotton farm with a cotton gin. Spent my growing up years there, went to Ole Miss, then was sent overseas during the Vietnam era, Army guy, came back, got a graduate degree, and then decided I wanted to farm with my father and did that for 21 years on the same farm where I grew up, Dunleith. And then I retired, moved to Oxford, and how, I don't know, but I segued into a job as a college professor. Grandparents? Well, on my father's side, they were Irish. On my mother's side, they were Italian. The Italians are more interesting. They came to this part of the world as immigrants and day laborers, really, and didn't know each other. And I write about them several times, and they met, squirreled away pennies, nickels, and so forth, and eventually were able to buy a farm of their own and settled in the Mississippi Delta and developed the farm and passed it on to their children. My father was born in the Depression era, got no education, but was able to, after the war, he served in World War II, and when he came back, he was able to start managing a farming operation and able to buy his own, and eventually was able to own a huge plantation with a cotton gin, Dunleith, about 3,000 acres.
And your other grandparents, what did they do?
They were farmers, all of them, cotton farmers.
Everybody lived in the Delta?
Everybody lived in the Delta and all buried there right now.
Where are they buried?
Right outside of Leland, in a graveyard.
Whereabouts is that for those of us that aren't familiar?
You won't find it on the map, and if you drive through it and blink your eyes, you will miss the whole place. It's just tiny. Leland. It's about the only town of any significance size-wise is Greenville, and it's about 7 miles west of Greenville, but that's not where I grew up. I grew up in Dunleith, which is about 10 more miles out in the remotest boondocks of the Mississippi Delta. I think probably of the ones who have passed on, the one that meant the most, that had the greatest impact on my life was my mother. She was Italian and barely spoke English, but she was able to bring 6 of us into the world and lived a long, fruitful life. And she was indeed the spark plug at my father's farming operation. She kept the books. She was up well before the rest of the world and raised 6 kids. I think that got her a one-way ticket to heaven, I'm sure.
So let's talk about you growing up. When were you born?
At 5 minutes before midnight on Friday the 13th, September of 1897. No, 1943.
I was going to let you age yourself.
But Italians are superstitious, and my mother was terrified of my being born on a Friday and the 13th. So she tried to hold out till after midnight, whether it be Saturday the 14th. Right. Now, whether that's 100% accurate, I can't say, but my mother she told everybody she knew that story. So. My first chore, I suppose it would have been gathering eggs. My mother had a huge flock of chickens. She loved them. And it was also evicting chicken snakes, which were commonplace. The bad thing about chicken snakes is you never knew they were in there until you reached in to grab the eggs. And it was unsettling, to say the least. When my father stepped up and did the impossible, a man with no education and no assets was able to persuade a wealthy man to help him buy that plantation I mentioned earlier, Dunleith. He was 18 hours a day, can to can't, 7 days a week, year round. And I was 10 years old at the time. And he turned me over to an old black guy that was on that plantation before he bought it. And said, I got too much to do, and this boy is a troublemaker, and I want you to straighten him out and teach him how to work. And that was probably one of the biggest blessings. I know it was one of the biggest blessings of my life, because he was tough on me, hard as he could be. He did teach me the value of hard work, but at the same time, he instilled in me the system of values that I live by to this day. And a great many of those values have been converted to the stories I write.
So what was the first thing that he did that made you realize this guy means business?
He sharpened my hoe. Back then we didn't have herbicides. You got rid of weeds with a hoe.
Right.
And he taught me how to hoe, how to chop cotton. That's the dullest. If Satan can come up with a punishment worse than chopping cotton, he's got something.
Tell us something else about him. What was his name?
Well, his name was Lonnie Thomas, but had you walked up to him and called him that, nobody, he probably wouldn't recognize it. Everybody called him Jaybird. That was his name. In fact, that book right there, the one I wrote before this one, the name of it is Boss, Jaybird, and Me. And my father was Boss, of course. A great many of the stories in this book, and I've forgotten this, I think it's 400 stories in there, but a great many of them are about Jaybird and about experiences we had together. He taught me how to fish, how to hunt, how to fight, how to chase women. He also taught me the value of being a good Christian human being. He took me to church with him. It was a tiny little country church right down the road, and as long as I was with Jaybird, my mother didn't worry, so I had the choice of going to town to church or going with Jaybird, and I liked his church better. I liked to listen to the women sing. They could sing so beautifully. I think probably if we had time, I know we don't, but if the first story in this book is a summation of this man's life. He was a study in opposites. He was as healthy as he could be. Not an ounce of fat on him anywhere. But at the same time, he smoked cigarettes and drank whiskey. He was extremely intelligent, had no education. Sadly, he could not even write his own name. But he had a great sense of humor, and he just adopted me. I was his son, and I mean, if somebody tried to hurt me in any way, they were going to pay a price. And at the same time, he didn't mind hurting me. If I didn't obey him, those hard knuckles, manly type hands, and he would knuckle me. It didn't take but a few of those, and you listen closely. When he got on up in years, it's kind of ironic the way it all worked out. When I was just a boy, he took care of me. If we went fishing, he would bait my hook so that I could catch a fish. And when he got older, he couldn't see. He had lost almost all of his vision. And it was ironic. I remember what a good feeling it was for me to bait his hook. And I found him a huge bobber that he could barely see if he got a bite. And those are the best memories I have of him. I mean, for instance, he took me fishing when I was, the first time I remember, and he lit up a cigarette. And I said, let me have one. And he never said a word. He didn't say a word. He just handed me the pack of cigarettes, and I took one out and lit it, puffed it about 3 times, and the next thing I know, I was emptying my lunch in the lake. And that was the end. I never smoked another cigarette. He knew that. He had a way of teaching. He was a master teacher. And he understood that if he could make me hate cigarettes, I'd never deal with. He did the same thing with gambling. I remember we were shooting dice one day, and I wanted to get involved, and I didn't have any money, and he said, "Here, I'll advance you some money, but you have to pay me back." And I did what so many gamblers do. I won a big pile and then lost it all and lost a lot more, and ended up having to give him my allowance check for the next 2 months. I never gamble anymore. But that was an art for Jay Bird. He had a way of in making a lesson indelible. It was there for the rest of your days. He was an extreme disciplinarian. And when I became a college teacher, I knew that deterrence was the best way to deal with just misbehaving youngsters, and it worked. And I got that from him. He is like I said, he is an endless story. And the book that just came out, this one right here, 100 by 500, every story in there makes some sort of direct or indirect reference to Jay Bird. My father, he came from abject poverty. His father was a cotton farmer. Had 15 acres of cotton. He was a big-time farmer. And they farmed with mules, and the Depression hit. He was expecting to sell his cotton for $1 a pound, ended up getting a nickel a pound for it, lost everything he had. They loaded up on a wagon and moved to the Mississippi Delta because they could find work there as carpenters. And that's how they ended up in the Delta. Anyway, when World War II began, he volunteered, was in the Navy, came back, and as I said earlier, he was looking for any kind of work, and his father-in-law, my mother's parents, helped him get a job as a farm manager. And he liked it. He realized that's what he wanted to do with his life. And he didn't have any education, but he had an instinct for good business. And he was able to convince a wealthy doctor locally to finance him, and he moved up from 200 acres to 3,000. And when he made 52 crops of cotton. And when the last bale of cotton came through his own cotton gin, he walked away and told me, he said, "It's y'all's now, I'm through." And he was.
Go back to Jay Bird. Did he have children?
Well, he had numerous, to say the least. He cycled through several nuptial cycles, I guess you'd say. And anyway, he did have a pretty good brood. Some of them were my best friends. One of his sons was my closest friend. He got killed in a car wreck when we were just boys. And he had some ways that were not always compatible with matrimony. And he liked to go to in the Delta, it's almost a second religion, juke joints, you know. And Jay Bird liked the juke joints, and he would always take me, you know, and it was interesting because I never thought anything about it. I had no fear because Jay Bird was taking good care of me. It was fun. He could sing. He could do the ham bone, which is almost an extinct art now. Anyway, he said, "I want you to kill those 3 mosquitoes exactly at the same time." Okay. And he said, "Now I want you to, every time you kill them, 3 more bites, you kill them." And he said, "Then tap your foot." Ham bone, where you been? Round the wood, going again. What you gonna do when you get back and take a walk about a railroad track? Ham bone. Now that is not the way Jay Bird did it. When he did it, everybody got up and danced. But that's pretty close. And I'm sure I'm the only extinct Caucasian in the world who can do that. But that just gives you an example of he could take a guy who has zero rhythm and teach you how to do the ham bone. He made his own songs up. They were ditties, not songs. When we would be out in the field chopping, he would just come up with the craziest little songs. Like I remember one of them he sang all the time. We have come a long ways together, but we got a long way to go though. And he'd just say that over and over again. You know, another one was Mary. "Oh, Mary, please don't weep. Oh, Mary, please don't weep." He'd just sing it over and over, and it was delightful to listen to. He had a great singing voice. Not like mine. But he always told me, he said, he'd make me sing in church, and I said, "I don't sing, I croak." And he would say, "Well, croak, damn it." So.
Whenever you got older, like in your teenage years?
Well, nothing changed with that. It would still get up in the morning, go to the field with Jay Bird and work all day. And then he taught me to run the gin. Jaybird knew that gin, every nut and bolt in it. He knew everything about it. And my father told him to teach me how to run it, and he did. He was just a master teacher. I think one of the most interesting aspects of our relationship had to do when I was drafted and sent overseas. My mother said that when the word got out that I might be coming home pretty soon, that my tour of duty was over, as I said earlier, I was a son to him. He loved me. And Mama said he would walk out to that long road leading up to the highway to the farm and watch every day, waiting for me to come back. And when I did, it was a joyous reunion, I tell you. I went on and did that and taught years
And we had these little steel army desks.
at Delta State and down on the coast in a community college.
Every row as you come
And then
back,
my
you
father
teared up.
lost his farm manager, and he knew that I knew just about everything there was to know about the farm and the gin. And he, as the Godfather said in the movie The Godfather, I made him an offer he couldn't refuse. I was making all of $6,900 a year teaching school, and my father offered me $15,000 a year, so it was a no-brainer. I came back to his manager, and when I did, Jaybird was still, as I said, he was up to the day he died, and he was right at 90 years old. His health was just intact, and we seemed to have just picked up right where we left off. By that time I was taller than he was, and not his boy anymore, but I still said yes sir and no sir.
He was your elder.
Oh yeah. As manager of the farm, I had access to all the chemicals that were being used, herbicide and pesticide. And some of the big companies like Monsanto and others would ask me to monitor the crop behavior with those products and just send the information I collected to them, and they'd send me big fat checks. So that's how I started, and then some of the observations, analyses, and so forth that I sent were good enough to be converted to what they called back then advertorials, part story and part advertisement. And some 2 or 3 magazines noticed it and started asking me to take freelance writing assignments and would pay my expenses and so forth. And then along the way, I started telling some of my funny stories at the office. They said, hey, write those down. And that's how it all started. That's why I'm so damn famous now.
What was your first book?
First it was just a tiny little book that, the name of it was Boss Jaybird and Me. That was it. But it was not that big one. And I thought, I said, this is a joke. It's not. And every single copy sold. I don't even have a copy myself. I actually made money as a writer. And then I decided one more step and I'll be famous forever. And I wrote the anthology, which was that little book combined with all the other stories that were not in the little book that I had written up to that point. All about Jaybird, almost all of them. And then along came this latest version, this 100 by 500, and as I told you earlier, the manuscript now being analyzed by the publisher is called 200 by 500. And the objective is to, before I croak, write one final huge anthology entitled 500 by 500. Will I make that goal or not? I don't know.
So tell us about how you write. I mean,
Well,
the
that's
the
good.
style.
I'm glad you asked. I do not have the discipline to be a novelist. I admire people who can write that way, but my niche is not just a short story, but a short story. When I was writing those humor columns for magazines, they would turn a lot of them down and they would just say too long. I kept using syntax and grammar to squeeze the stories down until I noticed that when I hit the level of about 500 words, they began to buy the stories. Magazines did. So I made that my goal. Every story I write is exactly 500 words, not one less, not one more. And apparently it works in the same way somewhat as poetry does. I'm a big fan of poetry, and that's what I primarily taught in college. But poetry is the ultimate distillation of language. And because not only every word has to be exact, every syllable, in order not to reduce or affect in a negative way the meter and rhythm and all the components that go together to make great poetry. And I kind of took my lead from that because
everybody interprets a poem a little bit differently because it doesn't give you the whole entire coverage like a novel will. I was telling my friend Lee earlier, one of my favorite poems is a little small poem called Anyone Lived in a Pretty House Town. Strange in title, but it only has 233 words in it. If the writer of that poem had used 233,000 words, he would have ruined it. So I began to write that way, and I think people appreciate that because every word in my stories, I tried my best to make them count. And by virtue of experience, not by brilliance, but just long years of doing it, I've developed a technique that some people find attractive, some don't. Some people say my stories are too short. But for the most part, people like that style of writing.
What's your favorite poem?
Oh, I would say The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which I can quote in its entirety.
Just a little bit of it. Quote a little bit of it.
All right, let's see if my favorite part would be, like one that on a lonesome road does walk in fear and dread, and having once turned round, walks on, and turns no more his head, because he knows a frightful fiend doth close behind him tread. In the poem, that's when the mariner had committed the vile sin of killing the albatross and was stuck in the doldrums, and all of the shipmates were dead, and there was not anything living except sea snakes. And then all of a sudden, something started to change. I like it because on a personal level, I have to deal with depression. I have to take antidepressant every day. That's why people say I'm always doped up. I just have to take it to live. But that particular verse I just quoted, it will be on my crematorial urn because it's perfect for anybody who's ever dealt with that problem. Mm-hmm. That frightful fiend that's close behind you tread.
What is another poem that's touched your life?
Anything Frost. Listen to this little poem. I mean, you talk about being able to, the ultimate distillation of words. Mm-hmm. Let's see. Nature's first green is gold. Her heart is hue to hold. Her early leaves are flower, but only so an hour. Then leaf subsides to leaf, so Eden sank to grief. So dawn goes down to day. Nothing gold can stay.
I like that.
I would probably sell my soul to Satan to have written that. It's just unbelievable. I mean, that's worth everything I've ever written times 10. Right. That one little poem.
Right.
That's why he's America's favorite poet. All of his poems that way. They all just hit you right there and right there at the same time.
So out of the two books that you have there, what's your favorite story out of the 100 by 500?
Probably one called Lagoon Bass.
Tell us about it.
I think I might have been imbibing the night that I wrote that. But that might have been a good thing. It's really about Jaybird fishing at one of his favorite fishing holes. And he kept trying to catch this huge bass that was in there, monster bass. And nothing worked. And then one day he was just about to give up, and he saw a squirrel. There was a nut, just a pecan, that had floated up onto a log in the water. And the squirrel couldn't resist it. He had to have that nut. So he worked his way down the limb till he got to the pecan and got it. And went on back up. And Jaybird said all of a sudden he could not believe his eyes. The monster bass came up and put another pecan on the limb. Waited a few minutes, and sure enough, the squirrel came back. The bass caught the squirrel and ate him. He died in a from arboreal freedom to bone-crushing horror. Ooh. And Jaybird rolled up his pole, took a snort of whiskey, and left, and never went back to catch that bass again. I don't know where that story came from, lady. I could not tell you in a million years.
Okay, out of The Boss, Jaybird and Me, what's your favorite story in that one?
That's hard to answer right off the bat, but it would have to be one of the ones with Jaybird, no doubt. I think I just used the very first one we talked about because the way he died was the way he lived. He's just all man. Mm-hmm. I was working, and some children came running up and said, "Mr. Jimmy," that's what people call him farm. Miss Jimmy, Bird's sick. Come quick. And when I got there, he was lying under a tree, and his hat was over his head, and there was a cigarette smoke coming up from it, and he was wrapping up his fishing bowl, getting ready to go fishing, and a stroke hit him, and he died instantly. But the beauty of it was, Jay Bird had a big shiny gold tooth, and he died. When he died, the pain of the stroke caused him to grimace, but he looked like he was smiling. You know, death doesn't frighten me at all, and that's the way he was. That's just all man.
Yeah. Wow. What would you like to tell me? What is something you want me to know?
I want you to tell everybody to buy bukus of my books. I'm a struggling writer. No, I want to tell you that that it's been an honor. I appreciate you going to all the trouble to come all the way over here to talk. Just believe me.
Yeah.
Outside of this conversation, you would find me to be one of the most dullest. Wait a minute, that's a double comparative, double superlative. Most dullest. I didn't say that. Dullest guys you would ever know. My big thrill in life is working crossword puzzles and Sudoku. So.
Thank you so much for talking with me. It has been a blast.
Thank you. I believe you really meant that.
I do. I have learned so much about the different writings, the different ways to write, and I can't wait to read some more of your books.
Thank you so much. In fact, I got one I brought as a gift. If you don't already have it, you have it now.
Oh, thank you.
Boss Jay Bird and Me anthology. You go take it home with you. How about
Oh my
that?
gosh, thank you so much. I can't wait to read it. I enjoyed the other one. Nancy let me borrow her copy of the 100 by 500.
I think the
So-
only thing I can say is a lot of people who fail to read the preface material don't quite get the full understanding of some of those stories. I believe that's important. So if you take time to read that book, I would go ahead and read the preface material, and then you probably would understand, especially the Jay Bird stories. They're the ones where I mentioned how he came into my life and changed my life, and how I ended up where I am. You know, it's not all pleasant memories, but I think it all ended with good purpose.
Good. Thank you for joining us here today. We have been pleasured. We've had the pleasure of being here in Square Books in Oxford, Mississippi, and we thank the management for letting us be here. And thank you again, Jimmy. I have had such a great pleasure knowing you.
Thank you so much. It's been a great honor to talk with somebody who knows how to ask intelligent questions, and you do. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you for joining us here today on From the Heart. Be sure and join us next time.